Shalom, everybody. It's our study on the book of Revelation. And I think I have some good news for you. I believe because of the relaxed rules and just the way things are going with the pandemic and I think next week we're going to meet at the building. And that'll be at 7 o'clock. And we will, for as many as want to meet, and we will distance ourselves somewhat, but we'll have a little bit to eat together, and at 6, and then we'll have our study at 7. Actually, scratch the. That's not correct. There will be no dinner, but there will be a study at 7 o'clock. Okay, we'll go slow on these things. Tell me what you think about it. Give us some emails and texts, and let us know. But I think next week would be a good time to begin, since we're opening up the building this Saturday at 10:30. The 9:30 class will still be Facebook Live. At 10:30 we'll have a service at the building, and then next Wednesday, why don't we try to have a Bible study? We'll still use Facebook Live to broadcast, but we'll just meet at the building. How about that? All right. Last week we talked about premillennialism, post-millennialism, and amillennial or present millennial thinking. And so we want to continue more or less that discussion, but from the text and from some historical considerations. Let's go back to Revelation 20, verse 5. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended, and this is the first resurrection. So the question is there 1,000 year of reign of the Messiah, literally, or is it figurative of the time between Messiah's first coming and second coming? Or is it an allegorical time, just an uncertain amount of time, but a good deal of time? Let's review a little bit of the history. I think I did a little bit of this already. And maybe these names you'll recognize and maybe not. In the Epistle of Barnabas, chapter 15, Barnabas seems to look at the 1,000 years as a literal 1,000 years. The problem with Barnabas is you can read it as him meaning a figurative amount of time as well. Is the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah, is that when the Lord comes back and eternity occurs? But Barnabas, anyway, seems to believe it was a physical 1,000 years. And Papias, an ecclesiastic historian, he's from about 60 CE to 130 CE, and he's the bishop of Hierapolis, which is in modern-day Turkey. Very influential, and he seems to think also that it's somewhat that it's literal. Justin Martyr, of course, was born in Israel but migrated to Italy, and that's where most of his time was served, between 100 and 165 CE. He's too in the literal camp. Irenaeus, who is from Smyrna, Turkey, he migrates to southern France, and 130 to 202. And he also seems to think it's a literal 1,000 years. Tertullian, whose dates are 155 to 220. His ministry was in Carthage, Tunisia, and he too sees this as. And all of these fellows have works. St. Augustine saw Revelation, adapted the Jewish intermediate reign of the Messiah to the final conflict and victory of the Messiah. The first resurrection is spiritual, the second resurrection is physical. In First Enoch, we've talked a lot about that book. Why? Because the language, the symbolism gives us the keys to unlock, especially apocalyptic, but generally speaking, New Testament language and imagery. And so the present age lasts 7 weeks, 7 eras. The Messianic kingdom is established in the 8th week. The wicked are subject to the righteous. The 9th week is the judgment upon the wicked. The 10th week sees judgment on the angels. And after this is the new heavens and new earth. I'm not going to go into the detail. This would take a long period of time. There is a logic behind why they believe these things. After this, the eternal age is described as many weeks without number in 1st Enoch. The Messianic age lasts from the 8th to the 10th week. 2nd Enoch, chapters 25 to 33, are probably the closest to the book of Revelation that we have. A day equals 1,000 years. The 7th day is the Messianic 1,000 years. The 8th day is a time where there's no calculation, no end, neither years, nor days, nor hours. The great judgment occurs in 2nd Enoch chapter 65. All of this is online in English. And kind of fun reading. Great judgment is at the end of creation and before eternity. Right? So 1,000 years is the Messianic era. This is in 2nd Enoch. This is in 1st Enoch. This is in the book of Jubilees. On and on and on and on. And so, okay, there's different people will see things differently. In the Apocalypse of Baruch, which is around 70 CE, so it's 1st century, contemporary more or less with the book of Revelation, or very close in proximity. Chapter 30, verse 1, the Messiah is revealed in glory. Verses 2 to 4, the earth will be tremendously fertile and the righteous will rise from the dead. Verse 5, the souls of the wicked will perish. And 39 to 40, verses 1 through 4, the Messiah is revealed in the 4th kingdom, which is Rome, by the way. The Messiah will kill that leader near Mount Zion, and his own reign lasts until the end of the world. In chapters 72 to 74, the Messiah gathers the nations, spares some, and eternity begins. All right. So you have an era of Messiah reigning, you have an era of doing battle, you have an era which is called eternity. 4th Ezra, this is late 1st century CE, so it's commensurate with Revelation, chapter 7, verses 26 to 30. A city which is now visible, a city which is now invisible will eventually appear, and that which it was concealed is going to be revealed. The Messiah is revealed to those who did not taste death, and the survivors will rejoice for 400 years. You see how different these things are? These speculations are so vastly different. At the end of these years, my son, the Messiah, shall die along with all humans. He will be silent for 7 days. General judgment begins. The resurrection of the good and the wicked leads to the final end, and the time is near. Okay, let's go to the Jewish side. Is there any conformity regarding the Jewish explanation of the Messianic age? We already commented on this some time ago, and remember what we said there. That, well, first of all, in the Mishnah, which is basically the 6 divisions of Jewish law, these comprise the declarations of what's called the Tanaim, the teachers, the central teachers, from about 150 BCE to, let's say, 220 CE. And very, very little is spoken of regarding the Messiah. It's not until we get into what's called the Gemara, the commentary, if you will, on the Mishnah, that we see the Messiah discussed. And even there, it's relegated to Haggadah. Remember that? Halakha is legally binding. Haggadah is not legally binding, but meant to deepen the message of the rules and regulations, the Halakha. So if we're to return a man's ox according to that came on our property, according to the halacha, the Haggadah will give shalom. The Haggadah will give like a story or some parables or so forth and so on to deepen that message. And obviously, those things are not binding, and so it is with the Messiah. It deepens the message of something that the Mishnah wants to talk about, and gives a little bit more breadth and hope for the Jewish people in the era of the Gemara to hold into. With the Mishnah alone, it's a bit sterile. People were losing hope. It's like the Mishnah, the main rabbinic work, really didn't give that much hope to the average Jew. So the Gemara was something that gave more hope. What are the early sages? Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, one of the great sages of the first century CE, about 90 CE, he says that the Messianic age is going to last 1,000 years. Okay. Rabbi Joshua, his contemporary, 90 CE again, no, it's going to last 2,000 years. Okay. Eliezer ben Azariah, one of the great sages of Israel, 100 CE, he says it's going to be 70 years. All right. Again, it's not important for this course to go into why they speculate these things. Rabbi Akiva, he's a 2nd century scholar, 135 CE. He says it's going to be 40 years. Yossi of Galilee, 110 CE, it's going to be 60 years. Dasa, 180 CE, says it's going to be 600 years. Eliezer ben Yossi of Galilee, 150 CE, it's going to be 400 years. And others around 90 CE say it's going to be 2,000 years. Some say it's as much as 7,000 years or 30,000 years. The speculation runs the gamut of everything that parallels the wandering in the wilderness to the 70 years of captivity to 1,000 years, which is a large period of time, to twice that, to, well, like I say, 30,000 years. So the only thing these things show regarding the church fathers and the Jewish scholars is that the book of Revelation is concurrent with the first century's way of viewing the end of days, but there is no common opinion as to what these things mean in terms of how long will it be for when the Messiah comes. How long will it be till he sets up his kingdom? And is that a different time than eternity? And how long will it be if he sets up his kingdom between the end of that earthly kingdom and the eternal kingdom, which will grow, as we're going to see in the book of Revelation, grow into the earth? That's one way of seeing it. Or that the earth and the heavens will be burned up. That's another way of seeing it. Or that the earth and the heavens will be rolled up as a scroll. It's all the same event described differently. But clearly heaven is as the Gospels teach us, heaven is pressing in on the earth. And one day it will explode onto the earth. And it'll just be heaven. The universe will be encompassed by heaven. And everything else that has been created will pass away, except those who trust in the Son and those of the righteous who will live forever and ever with him. So why does the second death have no power over those who partake in the first resurrection? Verse 6, blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. Right? Now remember, the first resurrection occurs after the 1,000 years. Symbolically, this is the reign of the Messiah, and if we're taking the reign of the Messiah to be now, it's all of those who are born during the reign of the Messiah, which would be between his coming, death, and resurrection, and his return. So blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death, we don't even know what that is yet, has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of the Messiah, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. So that's curious, because the first resurrection, we say earlier on, occurs after the 1,000 years, but now they're going to reign with him 1,000 years. It shows that these things are not concurrent. right? But it's the same era. And the second death we're going to find is obliteration, right? Spiritual death leads to obliteration. At least that's what we're going to propose. Did you catch what I'm saying? That the first resurrection occurs after the 1,000 years. The rest of the dead didn't live until the until 1,000 years. And then this says, "Blessed are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them." Well, if the first resurrection is spiritual, then we understand they reign with him 1,000 years. Right? When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison. The New Covenant writings tell us that something's going to be taken out of the way, and this Antichrist, this anti-Messiah, and his kingdom will flood onto the scene. So we're going to be talking about that, right? When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog, I know many people believe this is Russia or the area around Russia. To gather them to battle in number, they are like the sand on the seashore. This reminds us of Ezekiel 38 and 39, right? And what precedes Gog and Magog in Ezekiel chapter 38? Well, let's take a look at that. Chapter 38 of Ezekiel and verse 8. "After many days you will be called to arms. In the future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They have been brought out of the nations, and now all of them live in safety." Okay. So what's going to happen after that is going to be a revival, isn't it? Right? First resurrection. No, the first resurrection is a spiritual resurrection according to John chapter 5. I see the question. Pose your questions on line here because I can see them. Yeshua was the first fruits of the resurrection, and we will follow. But in John 5, we see those two resurrections. The time is coming, and now is when they that hear the voice of the Son of Man shall live. And then later on, the time is coming, but it doesn't say and now is. That deals with the physical resurrection, just before the eternal reign, if you will. At least that's what we have taught. And of course, you have a different opinion. You'll get your own Bible study. Gog. What does Gog mean? Is Gog a place? Is Magog a place? Certainly, we can find places. A place called Magog, and but Gog actually means mountain, and Magog, for those in the Hebrew class, May is the prefix from, isn't it? And so Gog is mountain, and Magog is from Gog, from the mountain. And where have we seen that before? We've seen it in the illustration of Babylon, right? The burning mountain tossed into the sea from the book of Jeremiah. Babylon represents who? It represents the harlot. It represents the anti-Messiah's kingdom. It represents the dragon's kingdom. It represents Sodom and Gomorrah. It represents all of the enemies of Israel. It represents